Jake and his team stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, and when the clicking sounds had fully receded into the depths of the station, Jake slowly and carefully turned his head toward the woman who had spoken. She was young and probably mid-20s with terrified blue eyes that pleaded with him to understand, and her name tag read, Amanda Cole Botanist. Jake moved his lips as minimally as possible and asked how many, and Amanda's eyes shifted left, then right, then left again, which meant 3. Jake breathed the words, asking, "How do we communicate?" And Amanda's eyes moved down to a tablet lying on the floor near her feet. Slowly and painfully slowly, Jake understood that he needed to get to a computer terminal, somewhere he could type without making sound. He gestured minutely to Peter Kim, the linguist, and pointed toward the nearest computer console, and Peter nodded almost imperceptibly and began the agonizing process of moving across the room. Each step took nearly a minute because Peter would shift his weight with glacial slowness and lower his foot with extraordinary care, and then pause to ensure no sound had been made. Jake had never seen such discipline and such control in his entire career. The clicking sounds returned twice during Peter's journey, and each time everyone froze completely and barely allowed themselves to breathe. The creatures would appear, and their reflective surfaces turned this way and that, scanning for something, whether it was movement or sound or intent. Jake could not tell. But each time the creatures eventually moved on and continued their patrol. After nearly an hour, Peter reached the console, and with trembling fingers moving with painful slowness, he activated the screen. The computer booted up silently, and thank God for the solid-state systems, and Peter accessed the station's internal messaging system. He typed asking if Amanda could access this terminal network, and on a screen across the room, Jake saw text appear. Amanda was responding using a tablet that must have been active in her pocket, and she confirmed she could access it and explained they had been using this method for 3 weeks, and this was how they coordinated everything. Peter typed asking what the creatures were, and there was a brief pause before Amanda responded. She said they did not know, and the creatures came from the caves, and there were 3 of them, and they patrolled constantly, and they reacted to sound and movement. Peter typed, asking what happens when they react, and there was a longer pause this time. Amanda's response made Jake's blood run cold when she explained that the creatures killed, and they were fast and very fast, and they had lost 8 people in the first hour and another 3 who tried to escape. Jake felt the weight of those words settle on him like a physical burden, because 8 people, dead in the first hour, meant these survivors had been living like this for 3 weeks and barely moving and barely breathing and trapped in their own bodies by fear and necessity. Peter typed asking how they ate and drank, and Amanda explained they had water, tubes and nutrients through simple medical lines, and Helen had set it up on the second day, and they took turns sleeping and always had someone watching. She explained that when the creatures were far away, they could move a little, but very little, and they had tried to leave, but the creatures killed 2 people at the airlock named Greg and Susan. Peter typed that they were going to get everyone out, and Amanda responded quickly asking how, because the creatures heard everything and saw movement, and they were always watching. Jake moved slowly toward Peter, and each step took forever, but when he finally reached the console, he placed his fingers on the keyboard. He identified himself as Captain Morrison and promised they would find a way to rescue everyone. Amanda responded explaining that the creatures sometimes went deeper into the caves, and all 3 at once would disappear, and they would be gone for maybe an hour, but not on any schedule, and it seemed random. Jake typed asking if they could move normally when the creatures were gone, and Amanda confirmed yes and explained they would eat and use the bathroom and check on each other, but then the creatures would come back and everyone had to freeze again. Jake asked how they knew when the creatures were coming back, and Amanda explained about the seismic sensors, because the caves ran under the whole station and they could feel the vibrations when the creatures moved. In the deep tunnels, Jake looked at Paul, who had been reading over his shoulder, and the security chief nodded slowly because they had a possible window, and if all 3 creatures went deep into the caves at the same time, they might have an hour to evacuate 43 people, but it was a gamble and a deadly one. Jake and his team spent the next 6 hours learning to live like the colonists and moving with agonizing slowness and communicating only through text and freezing completely when the clicking sounds approached. The Horizon maintained orbit overhead with Maya monitoring every transmission, and Jake had ordered her to prepare the ship for a rapid evacuation, but to remain silent unless contacted because any unexpected radio signal might draw the creature's attention. Through the terminal network, Jake learned the full horror of what had happened because the creatures had emerged from a newly discovered cave system that the geology team had been exploring. They had appeared without warning, and the colonists' first instinct to call out and to run and to react had been fatal. Helen Price, the station commander, had been in the mess hall during the initial attack, and she had watched the creatures kill 3 people who had screamed and ran, but she had also noticed that the creatures had passed by others who had frozen in fear. She had immediately understood the pattern and sent out a silent message on the station's network telling everyone not to move and not to make sound and to play dead. It had saved 35 lives that day. Since then, the survivors had developed a complex system of survival, and they had charts showing the creatures' patrol patterns, though these were frustratingly irregular. They had established shift schedules for sleep with strict protocols for remaining still even while unconscious, and they had rigged up silent systems for nutrition and hydration through basic medical equipment. But 3 weeks of this had taken a terrible toll on everyone, and several colonists were developing pressure sores from remaining in fixed positions too long. Others were showing signs of psychological breakdown, and one man, who was a geologist named Frank Porter, had stopped responding on the network 2 days ago. He still moved his eyes and still followed commands to blink, but something inside him had broken. Lisa sent a message to the group saying they needed to move soon, because medical conditions were getting worse, and several cases of blood clots were developing, along with muscle loss and psychological trauma. Jake typed back agreeing and said they would wait for the creatures to go deep and then they would evacuate everyone at once. Karen Ross, the xenobiologist, had been studying the creatures whenever they appeared, and she sent a message saying she did not think they were predators because their behavior was wrong. She explained that predators hunt, but these things seemed to be enforcing something like guards or wardens protecting territory. Peter asked via text what they were enforcing, and Karen replied that it might be silence and stillness, and maybe the caves were sacred to them, or maybe they were territorial and saw movement as a threat. Jake did not care about the why because he cared about getting these people out alive, but Karen's observations might be useful. If the creatures were territorial rather than predatory, they might not pursue beyond a certain boundary. Jake typed asking how far the creatures patrolled from the caves, and Amanda responded, saying they had never seen them go past the airlock, and they stayed inside the habitat modules. Karen added that the airlock was 50 meters from the cave entrance, and if they were territorial, that might be their boundary. Jake felt a plan forming in his mind, because if they could get everyone moving at the same time and get them through the airlock and into the landing shuttle before the creatures returned from the deep caves, they might make it. But they would need perfect timing and perfect silence and perfect luck. A message popped up from Helen Price, who had been silent until now, and Jake had seen her across the room standing near a wall, but she had been letting Amanda coordinate communication. Helen identified herself as the commander and said it was her responsibility to get her people home, and asked what Jake's plan was. Jake respected the quiet assertion of authority, and he typed that they would wait for all 3 creatures to go deep, and the seismic sensors would tell them when, and then they would move everyone at once using fast but controlled movements. He explained the shuttle could hold 50 people, and they would load everyone and launch before the creatures returned. Helen asked what would happen if they came back early, and Jake said they had weapons and would cover the retreat. Helen's response was sobering when she explained that their weapons did not work, and they had shot one of the creatures and it did not even slow down.
43 hours after the landing team arrived, the
seismic sensors registered unusual activity, and all 3 creatures moved toward the main cave entrance at the same time, with their clicking footsteps echoing through the corridors. Jake watched through the security cameras as the creatures descended into the darkness below the station, and the sensors tracked their movement, showing 3 distinct signatures moving deeper and deeper into the unexplored cave system. Helen Price sent a message saying this was it, and this was the longest they had gone deep in 3 weeks. Jake typed asking how much time they had, and Helen responded that the last time was 19 days ago, and they were gone for 72 minutes. Just over an hour, and they had to evacuate 43 people and get them through the airlock and load them into the shuttle and launch. Jake sent a message to everyone telling them to get ready, and when he gave the signal they should move quickly but as quietly as possible. He told them not to run unless he said to, and they would evacuate by sections with medical priority first and then everyone else. He organized teams with Paul and Danny leading the first group and Karen and Peter leading the second group and Jake and Lisa bringing up the rear with Helen. The seismic sensors showed the creatures still descending, and they were at 500 meters down and then 700 meters and then 1,000 meters. Jake sent the message saying now, and the station erupted into silent motion. Colonists who had been frozen for hours began moving, and their muscles were screaming in protest, and some could barely walk, while others had to be carried by the rescue team. Lisa and Karen immediately began checking people and identifying those who needed the most help, and a woman named Claire Adams could not stand because her legs had gone numb from maintaining the same position for too long. Danny White picked her up carefully and moved toward the airlock with steady steps. The first group of 15 colonists moved through the corridors like ghosts, and their footsteps were whisper-soft despite their urgency. Jake monitored the seismic sensors constantly, and the creatures were still deep and still descending at 1,200 meters, and then 1,500 meters. The first group reached the airlock, and Paul cycled it open manually, and the mechanical systems made soft hissing sounds that seemed loud after weeks of silence. The colonists filed through and moved into the landing shuttle beyond, and Paul sent a message saying Group 1 was loaded, and the shuttle was ready for Group 2. The second wave moved with Peter leading them, and Karen was helping a man who was limping badly. Amanda Cole was in this group, and Jake saw her glancing over her shoulder constantly because she expected the creatures to appear at any moment. The seismic sensors flickered and showed that the creatures had stopped descending, and they were holding position at 1,600 meters. Jake sent a message telling everyone to move faster because the creatures had stopped moving down. Group 2 picked up their pace, and several colonists stumbled, making soft thuds as they caught themselves. Jake's heart hammered in his chest because every sound felt like it could bring death, but the creatures remained deep in the caves. Group 2 reached the airlock and began loading into the shuttle, and Jake prepared the final group, which included himself and Lisa and Helen and 12 remaining colonists. Among them was Frank Porter, the geologist who had almost broken completely, and he moved like a machine following instructions, but with vacant eyes. Jake sent a message telling the last group to get ready, but then the seismic sensors spiked. The creatures were moving again, but not deeper, because they were ascending, and all three of them were rising through the cave system at incredible speed. Jake abandoned the network and spoke aloud, telling everyone to go now and to run because there was no more time for silence. The last group sprinted for the airlock, and Jake grabbed Frank's arm and pulled him along while Lisa supported an older woman who could not move fast enough on her own. The clicking sounds erupted from the caves, and the creatures were close and too close and getting closer every second. The group reached the airlock as the first creature emerged into the corridor behind them, and its reflective surface turned toward them. Jake saw the colonists' terrified faces reflected in that smooth surface, and he shouted for everyone to get in the shuttle. He pushed colonists through the airlock one by one, and the creature began moving toward them with its pace accelerating rapidly. The other two creatures emerged behind it, and all three were coming now. Helen was the last colonist through the airlock, and Jake and Lisa followed immediately, and Jake slammed his hand on the airlock control. The door began to close, but one of the creatures lunged forward, moving with impossible speed, and its blade-like limb shot through the closing door, reaching for them. Jake drew his plasma pistol and fired directly at the limb, and the bolt passed through the creature's appendage without any effect, just as Helen had warned, but the heat and light made the creature recoil slightly. The airlock door sealed shut with a heavy clang, and through the window Jake saw all three creatures reaching the exterior door with their limbs striking against the reinforced metal. The door held, but Jake could see it beginning to warp under the assault, and he knew it would not last long. He shouted into his comm, telling Paul to launch now, and the shuttle's engines fired immediately. Through the airlock window, Jake watched as the creatures continued their attack, and the metal was buckling and twisting, but then the shuttle lifted off. They were rising and rising away from the station, and away from the horrors below, and Jake felt the weight lift from his chest as they gained altitude. The Horizon's medical bay became overwhelmed within hours of their arrival because all 43 colonists needed immediate treatment for dehydration and muscle loss and pressure sores and psychological trauma. Dr. Lisa Hayes and her medical team worked around the clock, providing care and stabilizing patients who had endured 3 weeks of living hell. Jake stood in the observation deck looking down at Kepler 442b, and the colony station was still visible on the surface as a small cluster of lights in the darkness. Somewhere in those caves beneath it, 3 creatures patrolled an empty facility, enforcing their rule of silence to an audience that had escaped. Maya joined him at the window and said that the colonists were talking now that they were safe, and some of them would not stop talking while others could not say a word. Jake said quietly that it was post-traumatic stress, because 3 weeks of being unable to move and unable to speak, and knowing that the slightest sound could mean death was something he could not imagine. Maya told him that Helen Price wanted to debrief with him, and she had theories about what those things were. Jake followed Maya to the briefing room where Helen waited with Karen Ross and Peter Kim, and Helen looked years older than she had in her last video transmission 3 weeks ago. The ordeal had carved lines into her face and put shadows under her eyes that might never fade. Helen began without any greeting and said she needed to report something that did not make it into their emergency messages, and it was something they discovered before they lost the ability to communicate. Jake took a seat and told her to go ahead with her report. Helen pulled up a display showing geological survey data from the caves and explained that her team was mapping the cave system when they found something unusual. It was an artificial structure buried deep in the rock, and it was old and really old and maybe millions of years old. Karen leaned forward asking what kind of structure it was, and Helen said they did not know because they only got partial scans before the creatures appeared. But it was definitely not natural, and there were patterns and symmetry and mathematical precision, so it was a construction of some kind. Jake studied the scans, and whatever was down there was massive and spanning several square kilometers underground. He asked if Helen thought the creatures came from this structure, and Helen said maybe, or they were guarding it. She explained that their behavior suggested they did not hunt and did not feed, and did not seem to have any biological needs, and they just patrolled and enforced absolute stillness and silence near the structure. Peter said softly that they were guardians protecting something ancient, and Karen added that maybe the structure was not a building, but a prison. The room fell silent, and Jake considered the implications of an ancient prison buried on a supposedly uninhabited world, and guarded by creatures that enforced silence and stillness. What could be imprisoned there, and who had built the prison and why? Jake said finally that they needed to report this to Earth Command, because this was beyond their mission parameters, and they would want to send specialists and archaeologists and military assets. Maya's voice crackled over the comm, telling Jake he needed to come to the bridge immediately, and the urgency in her tone made everyone move. Jake rushed to the bridge with the others following, and Maya was standing at the sensor console with her face pale. Jake demanded to know what was happening, and Maya pointed at the display, saying she had been running continuous scans of the colony station, and 5 minutes ago the seismic sensors picked up massive activity underground. The display showed a 3-dimensional map of the cave system, and throughout the entire network dozens and then hundreds of signatures were lighting up. The 3 creatures they had encountered were just the beginning of something much larger. Jake asked how many there were, even though he dreaded the answer, and Maya said there were at least 200 distinct signatures, and they were all moving and ascending toward the surface. Jake asked if they were coming after the ship, but Maya said no, and they were spreading out and moving away from the colony in all directions. It was like they were establishing a perimeter and expanding their territory across the planet. Helen had followed them to the bridge, and she stared at the display in horror, saying they woke them up, and when they found the structure, they woke them all up. Jake ordered Maya to set course for the edge of the system at maximum speed and to get them out of there immediately. Maya asked about Earth Command and the report they needed to send, and Jake told her to send it now via quantum communication with Priority 1 status. He told her to inform Earth Command that Kepler 442b was now a restricted zone, and nobody should come here without full military escort and proper containment protocols. As the horizon accelerated away from the planet, Jake watched the sensor readings, and the creatures were spreading across the surface with their numbers growing as more emerged from the deep caves. In a few days they would cover the entire colony site, and in a few weeks perhaps the entire continent. And somewhere below all of that, an ancient structure lay waiting in the darkness with its purpose unknown, and its creators long gone. The journey back to Earth took 4 months, and during that time the horizon became a ship of healing and nightmares. The colonists struggled with what they had endured, and several required constant psychological support from the medical team. Frank Porter never fully recovered from his ordeal, and he spent his days in the medical bay staring at nothing and occasionally whispering, "Do not move because they are listening." No amount of counseling could break through the trauma that had been carved into his mind. Amanda Cole, by contrast, threw herself into documenting everything she could remember about the creatures, and she worked with Karen Ross to compile behavioral studies and hypotheses and survival strategies. Her work became a critical resource that Earth Command later used to develop protocols for similar encounters. Helen Price submitted her resignation the moment they entered Earth orbit, and she told Jake during their final conversation aboard the Horizon that she had lost 8 people. She said those 8 people trusted her to keep them safe and she had failed them completely. Jake countered that she had saved 35 lives in a situation nobody could have anticipated, and she did what she had to do. Helen said quietly that she would have to live with it regardless, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering what they woke up down there in those caves. Earth Command debriefed the crew for weeks, and the story of Kepler 442b spread through military and scientific channels, becoming the subject of intense study. Several research teams proposed return expeditions, but all were denied immediately, and the planet was placed under permanent quarantine. Long-range sensor satellites were positioned to monitor the planet, but otherwise it was left completely alone. Jake was promoted to commander and given command of a new vessel called the Aurora, which was specifically designed for first contact scenarios and handling threats from unknown life forms. Several of his original crew transferred with him, including Maya and Paul and Lisa, because they had proven themselves in the worst possible circumstances. Peter Kim left the service to work with trauma survivors, and he used his linguistic skills to help people find words for experiences that seemed beyond description. He stayed in touch with many of the Kepler 442b survivors, and offered support and understanding that only someone who had shared their ordeal could truly provide. Karen Ross accepted a position at the Research Institute, where she became the leading expert on the creatures she called wardens. Her work influenced policy across all human-explored space and established protocols for approaching ancient sites and unknown structures on alien worlds. The display showed a 3-dimensional map of the cave system, and throughout the entire network, dozens and then hundreds of signatures were lighting up. The 3 creatures they had encountered were just the beginning of something much larger. Jake asked how many there were, even though he dreaded the answer, and Maya said there were at least 200 distinct signatures, and they were all moving and ascending toward the surface. Jake asked if they were coming after the ship, but Maya said no, and they were spreading out and moving away from the colony in all directions. It was like they were establishing a perimeter and expanding their territory across the planet. Helen had followed them to the bridge, and she stared at the display in horror, saying they woke them up. And when they found the structure, they woke them all up. Jake ordered Maya to set course for the edge of the system at maximum speed, and to get them out of there immediately. Maya asked about Earth Command and the report they needed to send, and Jake told her to send it now via quantum communication, with Priority 1 status. He told her to inform Earth Command that Kepler 442b was now a restricted zone, and nobody should come here without full military escort and proper containment protocols. As the Horizon accelerated away from the planet, Jake watched the sensor readings, and the creatures were spreading across the surface, with their numbers growing as more emerged from the deep caves. In a few days they would cover the entire colony site, and in a few weeks perhaps the entire continent. And somewhere below all of that, an ancient structure lay waiting in the darkness, with its purpose unknown and its creators long gone. The journey back to Earth took 4 months, and during that time, the Horizon became a ship of healing and nightmares. The colonists struggled with what they had endured, and several required constant psychological support from the medical team. Frank Porter never fully recovered from his ordeal, and he spent his days in the medical bay staring at nothing and occasionally whispering, "Do not move, because they are listening." No amount of counseling could break through the trauma that had been carved into his mind. Amanda Cole, by contrast, threw herself into documenting everything she could remember about the creatures, and she worked with Karen Ross to compile behavioral studies and hypotheses and survival strategies. Her work became a critical resource that Earth Command later used to develop protocols for similar encounters. Helen Price submitted her resignation the moment they entered Earth orbit, and she told Jake during their final conversation aboard the Horizon that she had lost 8 people. She said those 8 people trusted her to keep them safe, and she had failed them completely. Jake countered that she had saved 35 lives in a situation nobody could have anticipated, and she did what she had to do. Helen said quietly that she would have to live with it regardless, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering what they woke up down there in those caves. Earth Command debriefed the crew for weeks, and the story of Kepler 442b spread through military and scientific channels, becoming the subject of intense study. Several research teams proposed return expeditions, but all were denied immediately, and the planet was placed under permanent quarantine. Long-range sensor satellites were positioned to monitor the planet, but otherwise it was left completely alone. Jake was promoted to commander and given command of a new vessel called the Aurora, which was specifically designed for first contact scenarios and handling threats from unknown life forms. Several of his original crew transferred with him, including Maya and Paul and Lisa, because they had proven themselves in the worst possible circumstances. Peter Kim left the service to work with trauma survivors, and he used his linguistic skills to help people find words for experiences that seemed beyond description. He stayed in touch with many of the Kepler 442b survivors and offered support and understanding that only someone who had shared their ordeal could truly provide. Karen Ross accepted a position at the Research Institute, where she became the leading expert on the creatures she called wardens. Her work influenced policy across all human-explored space and established protocols for approaching ancient sites and unknown structures on alien worlds. 6 months after the Horizon returned to Earth, Jake received a message from Amanda Cole, and she had joined an archaeological research division and was studying similar structures detected on other worlds. Her message was brief but pointed, and she wrote that they had found 3 more sites that matched the geological profile of the structure on Kepler 442b, different planets and different systems, but the same basic configuration, with ancient structures buried deep, and in every case the planets were listed as uninhabited in colonial surveys. Amanda wrote that she thought they were all prisons, and she thought they all had wardens protecting them. She said they needed to find out who built these things and what they were guarding before humanity accidentally released something worse. Jake forwarded the message to Earth Command with his own recommendation that humanity needed to stop expanding blindly into the galaxy and start asking questions about who had been there before them. 3 years after the Kepler 442b incident, Jake Morrison stood in the command center of a new branch of Earth Command, created specifically to investigate ancient sites and potential threats. His team had grown to include specialists from dozens of fields, including archaeologists and linguists, and military strategists and survivors of first contact incidents. Amanda Cole was his chief research advisor, and she had spent 3 years compiling data on what they now called warden sites, which were ancient prison-like structures guarded by the silent creatures. They had identified 19 confirmed sites across human-explored space and suspected dozens more existed in uncharted regions. Amanda said during a briefing that they were getting better at detecting the sites because the geological signatures were consistent, deep underground structures with mathematical precision in construction, and always in regions where seismic activity was minimal. She explained that whoever built these wanted them to last forever. Jake asked if there was any progress on dating the structures, and Amanda said the best estimates put them between 5 and 8 million years old as a minimum. She added they could be much older than that. Karen added via video link from the Research Institute that the structures were still functional, and the wardens showed no signs of deterioration. They did not age and did not need maintenance and did not require energy sources that humans could detect. She said they were perfect guardians built to last. Paul asked what they were guarding, though, because in 3 years they had not gotten close enough to any of these structures to actually see what was inside them. Maya, who was monitoring remote sensor data from 6 different warden sites, said that every time they tried, the wardens responded. Any attempt to approach triggered an increase in warden activity, and they were protecting something and they were willing to kill to do it. Jake looked at the holographic star map showing all known warden sites, and they were scattered across the galaxy with no apparent pattern, but one thing was consistent. They were all far from any major stellar civilizations and placed in isolation on worlds that appeared empty and worthless. Jake said aloud, "What if that was the point, and what if these were not prisons containing something dangerous? What if they were sanctuaries protecting something precious from the rest of the galaxy?" The room fell silent because it was a perspective they had not considered before. Amanda asked sanctuaries for what, and Jake said he did not know but told them to think about it. The wardens did not hunt and they did not expand beyond a certain territory, and they only enforced silence and stillness. What if they were not keeping something in, but keeping everyone else out? Helen Price, who now worked as a consultant for the division, spoke up from the back of the room, saying if that was true, then every time they had tried to investigate these sites, they had been the intruders and the threats. Karen added that humanity's expansion into the galaxy had already disturbed at least 19 of these sites, and they had woken up guardians that were meant to sleep. They had threatened whatever the wardens were protecting. Jake felt the weight of that realization, because humanity had spread across the stars with confidence and pride, assuming that silence meant emptiness and that stillness meant death. They had never considered that some things were meant to remain undisturbed. Paul asked what they should do now, and should they stop expanding or abandon colonies near warden sites. Jake said they needed to learn to recognize the boundaries and map every site they could find and establish quarantine zones. No colonies and no research and no contact whatsoever. They needed to leave the sites alone. Maya said that Earth Command would not like that, because these worlds had resources and potential colonies, and they would want access to them. Jake replied that Earth Command needed to understand what they were risking, because they had barely escaped from one warden site with 43 survivors. They knew there were at least 200 wardens on Kepler 442b alone, and if they provoked a coordinated response from multiple sites, the consequences would be catastrophic. The research station on Kepler 442b had gone dark 3 weeks ago, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Horizon, staring at the frozen image on the main screen. The last transmission from the colony showed nothing unusual, and it was just the routine daily report from Station Commander Helen Price. But then there was only silence. Jake asked if there was any response to their calls, even though he already knew the answer, and Lieutenant Maya Chen shook her head from her position at communications, saying there was nothing and complete radio silence but life. Support systems were active, and the power grid was functioning normally. Yet nobody was responding. The Horizon entered orbit around the blue-green world, and Jake felt the familiar weight of command pressing down on his shoulders because 43 colonists lived on that station, and they were 43 people who had simply stopped talking to the rest of humanity. Jake ordered his crew to prepare the landing team, and he wanted full environmental suits and maximum caution because something made them go quiet, and he wanted to know what before they set foot down there. Lieutenant Paul Grant, who was the ship's security chief, stepped forward and recommended they send drones first to map the interior and check for hazards, and Jake agreed immediately. The drones descended through the atmosphere, and their cameras transmitted crystal-clear images back to the Horizon showing that the colony appeared pristine from the outside with no damage and no signs of struggle and no indication of what had silenced an entire research station. The drones entered the main habitat module, and the crew on the bridge fell silent because people were visible through the cameras, and they were sitting at tables and lying in bunks and standing in corridors, and they were alive with their chests rising and falling with breath, but they were completely motionless and frozen in place like statues. Maya whispered, asking what the hell was happening, and Jake leaned forward, studying the images, and asked if they were conscious. Dr. Lisa Hayes, who was the medical officer, reported from her station that biometric scans showed normal brain activity, and they were awake, but they were just not moving at all. Jake asked if they were not moving at all, and Lisa adjusted her scanner, saying she was detecting minimal movement, like breathing and blinking and slight finger twitches, but nothing more. Jake watched as one of the drones moved closer to a woman sitting at a dining table, and her eyes tracked the drone's movement and followed it with obvious awareness because she was aware and alert and terrified. Jake commanded his team to get a landing team ready now because something had those people trapped and they were getting them out. The landing team consisted of 6 people, including Jake and Paul and Lisa and engineer Danny White and xenobiologist Karen Ross and linguist Peter Kim, and they descended to the surface in full environmental suits with weapons ready and medical equipment packed. The colony's airlock cycled without issue, and atmosphere readings showed breathable air with normal temperature and no contaminants, so everything appeared normal except for the 43 people who had become living statues. They entered the main habitat corridor carefully, and the colonists they passed were frozen in various poses, with some standing, and some sitting, and some caught mid-stride, but their eyes followed the landing team with desperate intensity. Lisa asked a man standing near the entrance if he could hear her, and his eyes shifted to her, and he blinked once deliberately, which meant yes. Jake instructed his team not to move because if they were afraid to move, then they needed to understand why before they did anything that might cause trouble. A sound cut through the air, and it was not loud, but it was distinct, like a click, similar to claws on metal, and it was coming from somewhere deeper in the station. Every colonist's eyes widened in terror, and one woman's hand trembled slightly, and Jake saw tears forming in her eyes because the fear was palpable. Jake whispered for everyone to freeze, and his team stopped moving immediately. The clicking sound moved closer and Jake's heart hammered in his chest, but he remained perfectly still. And through his helmet he could hear his own breathing, which suddenly seemed too loud in the silence. Then he saw it, and a creature emerged from a side corridor. The creature stood roughly 7 feet tall with a body that seemed to shift and shimmer in the light, and its form was vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways that made Jake's brain hurt to process. Multiple limbs extended from its torso, and each ended in delicate razor-sharp points, and where its head should be, there was only a smooth reflective surface that seemed to absorb light. The creature moved with unsettling grace, and its limbs clicked against the metal floor, and it passed within 3 feet of a frozen colonist, and Jake saw the man's entire body. Trembling with the effort of remaining still, the creature paused, and its reflective surface turned toward the colonist, and for 5 agonizing seconds it studied the man, but then it moved on and clicked its way down the corridor until it disappeared around a corner. Nobody moved for a full minute after it vanished, and then from Jake's left he heard the softest whisper. A young woman with blonde hair was barely moving her lips, and her voice was so quiet he almost missed it when she said, "If we breathe too loud, they'll get mad."